So without further ado, let me just start out. I want to give you guys a conventional dating. This is what I'm about to give you are the dates that are agreed upon by the majority of scholars working in the ancient Near East of the earliest periods of humanity. And these dates are agreed on, again, by most scholars. This is conventional dating of Mesopotamian periodization, which is where the archaeological record begins. That's where we first see human remains or human artifacts as we see them in Turkey, in the Tigris and Euphrates headwaters, all the way up into Armenia, or rather Asia Minor, Turkey, modern day Turkey, all the way down into Mesopotamia. So let's look at these dates. The first date that scholars look at when you look at the early periods of the Earth's history is the lower Paleolithic, Paleo meaning old, Lithic Stone Age, the Old Stone Age, 300,000 to 80,000 BC is the date they assign to that. You've got the Middle Paleolithic that ranges from 80 to 30,000 BC. The Upper Paleolithic, 30,000 to 12,000 / 11,000, give or take a few years. The Mesolithic, or the period called the Epipaleolithic, 12,000 to 9,000 BC. Then we begin to see pottery. So those first ages, the first 4 ages, the Paleolithic and the Epipaleolithic, this is a fairly long period of time. There is human habitation. There are humans. They're not building cities, but they are living in caves. They are using stone tools, okay? That's known about. And this would be approximately when Neanderthals would have lived. And this would have been when we find cave paintings, such as we find in France at Lascaux and other parts of the world. We're going to talk about another discovery that was found a couple of decades ago in the Italian Alps. They found a man from the Paleolithic, or the Neolithic rather. I think it was, I don't know if it was pre-pottery. The dates change on him, so that's why I'm not sure about it. But it was a guy from the Stone Age. They found a human body in the Italian Alps from the Stone Age, and he was perfectly preserved. His skin was still intact. His stomach contents were still intact. He was frozen in a glacier on mountains in the Italian Alps. And they gave his name Otzi, the Iceman. We'll talk about that. So the pre-pottery Neolithic, so this is right at the beginning of pottery making. All right, hang on one second. I'm getting a little bit of, this happens sometimes. My thing will freeze up. So sorry about that. What's happening? So much information here. It just had overload. All right. Let me see if I can escape out of here. Where'd it go? Come on. Come on, computer. There it goes. So we have, yeah, there it goes. I got it kicked off. I was getting worried there. So pre-pottery Neolithic A, they kind of subdivide this into 2 different branches, pre-pottery A and pre-pottery Neolithic B. And then you have the Ubaid period, which is a very well known about period in Mesopotamia, that's 6,000 to 4,000 BC. Then we have something called the Uruk period, 4,000 to 3,000 BC, and that's broken up also into 3 other phases: the early, the middle, and the late Uruk. And it is in the late Uruk where history begins. History begins in the late Uruk. So that shows you that there was quite a long period of time in which we don't, I mean, it's not to say that humans didn't have writing. We just have no evidence of it. There's no physical archaeological evidence of human writing before this time period. It's not until humans began to settle into cities in Mesopotamia that they began to slow down and to begin to practice agriculture and live in cities that we see writing begin. And this happens at the Uruk expansion, which actually, we'll talk about this also, is when I believe the Tower of Babel. This is the beginnings of the Tower of Babel, the Uruk expansion. Then you've got the Jemdet Nasser period that comes after that, 3000 to 2900 BC. And then we enter into a period in Mesopotamia called the early dynastic period, 2900 to 2300 BC. Early dynastic. And this time period is really interesting to me because this is when in Mesopotamia, and when I say Mesopotamia, what I mean is the land between the rivers. And the rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that run in modern day Iraq. So the Tigris would be in the north. They run sort of northwest to southeast in a southeasterly direction, and they empty out into the Persian Gulf. The headwaters are all the way up into Turkey, and they empty out into the headwaters, again, of the Persian Gulf. And so anyway, this is where humans began to settle down and build cities. And one, in fact, the earliest city that we know of, true city, is a city called Eridu, or Eridu. And it's found in the lower Mesopotamia in southeastern Iraq, just a few kilometers from the site of Ur of the Chaldees. It actually predates Ur by several centuries. It's the earliest city in the world. It's called Eridu. And guess what? This is where the Uruk expansion centers on. When we look at all the arrows, you're going to see this in a moment. I'm going to show you this. This is where we believe the Tower of Babel was located, in Eridu, not in Babylon. Babylon's much later, because in Genesis chapter 10 or 11, we read about God confounding the builders of the tower and confounding their language, and they spread out. And we see this in the archaeological record in the late Uruk expansion. In the dynastic period, we also have subdivided into early dynastic 1, 2, 3, A and B. And the, let me go back. In the early dynastic 3B period, it's also known as the early Akkadian period, in the Akkadian Empire. The early Akkadian period is really interesting. There was a king by the name of Sargon the Great, or Sargon the First, who lived from 2320 to 2265 BC. And I believe, as well as some of my colleagues believe, that Sargon is the biblical person of Nimrod, mentioned in Genesis chapter 10. He united the Sumerian and Akkadian speaking peoples. And we know that Sargon and Nimrod both built great empires. And when we read the biblical characteristics of Nimrod, and when you look at the historical inscriptions about Sargon, they match perfectly. And he's also connected to some other things as well. So there's some pretty good circumstantial evidence that Nimrod, mentioned in Genesis, is none other than Sargon the Great, Sargon the first empire builder in history. A couple other kings in the early Akkadian period. I'm not going to give you all of them. Rimush, Man-ish-tushu, and Naram-Sin, 2241 to 2185 BC. Another period that comes after this is called the Ur-3 period. It's a fairly well-known. When I say well-known, I use that in sort of parentheses because the further we go back in time, it can get really cloudy, but it's fairly well known in the archaeological record. The most famous of the founder of the Ur-3 period was a king by the name of Ur-Nammu, who lived 2111 to 2094 BC. We're going to come to Abraham here in a moment, but Abraham was born about 2166 BC, and we believe that he left Ur around 2090, somewhere around 2090 BC or so. And this would have been right at the beginning of the reign of Ur-Nammu. Now, let me say a couple things about Ur-Nammu, again, just so you can give you some historical context. And the dates that I have for Abraham, there are evangelical scholars who have different dates of Abraham. There is a early Abraham, and that's the dates that I hold to. That Abraham was much earlier than what we think, based on some Old Testament internal text. I hold to the earlier dates, which places Abraham at the beginning of the Ur-Nammu or Ur-3 period. And then the latter believes Abraham lived much later than that, maybe 200 years to 1,000 years after that, or 400 years after that. But we have some other kings in this line. Oh, I was just say something about Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu basically drove out this barbaric group that invaded from the north in the Zagros Mountains. So if you look at a picture of Iraq, and you look to the north of Iraq, you've got Persia, or ancient, or it's Iran, or ancient Persia. And there were a group of people called the Gutians, G-U-T-I-A-N-S, Gutians. And the Gutians culturally were much more, for lack of a better term, barbaric than the Sumerians. Sumerian civilization was fairly well, they were very refined, shall we say. They had a beautiful artistic culture. We see in the material culture is very artistic. And then when the Gutians invaded Mesopotamia and the city-states, they brought in this sort of very heavy-handed rule. So it was Ur-Nammu who united the city-states of Mesopotamia to drive out the Gutians. And he was sort of like he issued a bunch of reforms in Mesopotamia, and he was sort of like a Charlemagne, if you will, before Charlemagne. He not only did he drive the Gutians out, he also established law codes. In fact, we believe that the Code of Hammurabi was actually influenced by the Code of Ur-Nammu that we have record of as well. Not only that, but Ur-Nammu also built ziggurats. Ziggurats are stepped temples, these pyramids that look, well, they look like it's not a perfectly smooth pyramid, but they're like stepped pyramids. And so in Ur, he built the great pyramid of Ur-Nammu at Ur. And again, this would have been after Abraham left. So Abraham left right as Ur-Nammu came to power, and he went up north into Haran. So just to give you some historical context background as to the time frame of when Abraham would have lived. He's living at the very beginnings of human civilization as we know it. A couple other names of these Ur-3 period kings: Amar-Sin, and then Shu-Sin, and then Ibi-Sin. Kind of wonder about that sin. Of course, it's not, they don't mean sin in the same way that we do. It's interesting, their names.